Oh, wow. We've already hit $35 trillion worth of debt.
We are creating 1 trillion in debt every 100 days, which took 200 years to do the first time. That's in essence $100,000 every second. Gold is going to go to a level that people don't expect.
They're all working really hard to already integrate AI into their businesses and create efficiencies.
What if all of a sudden you don't need to hold dollars any longer to buy oil? And the realization that there's another settlement currency. What would happen to the system? Hyperinflation would ensue, rates would go to the moon, and stocks, bonds, real estate, the over-leveraged and undercapitalized banks and the insurance companies loaded with treasures, just like that, they all evaporate. We are nowhere near out of the banking crisis, not even by a long shot. In a world edging towards economic collapse and societal upheaval,
We're up against a real polycrisis.
inflation is eating away at our savings.
A shaky banking system is putting our financial security at risk.
Government debt
There's unthinkable record highs.
and the wealth gap keeps growing thanks to an unjust monetary system.
Add in AI,
And advances in longevity disrupting jobs,
a looming property crisis,
geopolitical tensions.
and it's clear we've got our work cut out for us.
Our podcast is here to offer some hope
We're all about navigating these challenges by advocating for sound money principles.
and smart use of tech,
Our goal is to help you take control of your financial future
showcasing resilience, determination.
and practical solutions in these turbulent times. My name is Jason Cousins, founder and CEO of gold currency platform Glint.
And I am Andy Schechtman, CEO of gold bullion dealer Miles Franklin.
Welcome to the Resilient Compass podcast. A quick one before we get back to this episode. Just give me 30 seconds of your time. There are two things I want to say. The first one is I want to say a big thank you to the army of you who already work with us as clients and who support our mission. And for those taking the time to tune in and listen to the show today, your support is very important. And secondly, we are just getting started. And if you like what we are doing, please hit the subscribe button and add your comments below. We need to know what matters to you. It is really important to help us grow and spread our mission. Thank you. Now back to the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Resilient Compass podcast. I'm joining from Bali, and my co-host Andy Schechtman. Andy, I believe you're in the Bahamas. How are you doing?
I just got back, although I'd like to hop on a plane and head back over there. It was nice to relax and unplug for a little bit, Jason. But unfortunately, I'm back home in the saddle.
I'm still in Bali, actually surrounded by lots of gold. All the temples around here have lots of gold on them. But Andy, I know a lot of people probably know who you are already, but why don't you give everybody a short explanation about your background?
Yeah, I've been running Miles Franklin, a company I started with my father almost 35 years ago on a wing and a prayer. I guess you could call us the embodiment of the American dream. And in 35 years, we've done close to 10 billion in sales and never had a customer complaint. We're very proud of our reputation, and it's enabled me to meet great guys like you, open doors that wouldn't have otherwise been open to me. And I learned long ago that relationships are the most important thing, whether it be in our day-to-day operations with our clients or in building symmetry with people like yourself. And it's an honor to be here with you, Jason. It truly is. From a company that focuses on old school, in your possession precious metals to one like yours, who focuses more on the digital transition to precious metals and another way of thinking about precious metals. I'm very eager to be here with you and to do these podcasts. And for that, I thank you.
Yeah, and echo the sentiment. It was great to meet you. And we've gone on really well. And I think it's ended up in us deciding to do this podcast. A little bit about myself. So I actually trained as an architect of buildings, not of software, back in the day. And I was the founder of a VR business and e-commerce business in the 90s and the noughties. And it was in 2008, for those of you who remember, that I first became awakened to what was going on. It's the first time I realized that a bank is not a risk-free deposit of funds. It was the first time that I realized the money in my wallet was becoming worthless, literally day by day. Yep. And so I set out to do something about it. And Glint, the company I'm the founder and the CEO of, is the first platform in the world to enable gold and electronic payments. For those of you who don't know, we're a bit behind in terms of Andy's doing on things in terms of turnover and stuff, but we've done about $500 million worth of transactions. We've got a couple of 100,000 registered users and about 50,000 of them are monthly active clients. And some of the newspapers in the UK have said that we're the fastest growing UK tech company. Although US actually is where the majority of our business is coming from at the moment. And so we've got a very singular focus as to give everyone, or to help give everyone, an equal opportunity to prosper. That doesn't mean everyone will, but to create a level playing field, we're providing a reliable, sound money, an electronic gold-enabled gold currency. Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm really excited about this podcast, Andy. I've got big ideas and thoughts about it. I think we can together do a lot. We're going to have some interesting people on the show as well, as we want to get other people's ideas in on things. But I can imagine that a lot of people listening to the kind of intro to the podcast are thinking, are we over exaggerating a little bit? In fact, my mother-in-law sent me a WhatsApp group message the other day. I think she'd listened to something that Peter Schiff had said, and she said, this is a bit scaremongering, isn't it? Question mark. And I had to say, actually, no, it's not. When you hear in a world edging towards economic collapse and society upheaval, we're actually living this. This is happening now, isn't it? Andy, shall we add some color to those issues that we
100%. Absolutely. And that's the issue too, Jason, when you get to the end of a long macro cycle, it's hard for people to actually think that things could actually change. And I agree to your point. I think they are. And it's important to think as a contrarian these days. In fact, if you don't, I think you will end up being to some degree or another a victim. So yeah, let's add some color and dig in. I think that's a good way to start.
Yeah, I agree with you. We totally live within a kind of we have recency bias. We don't want to, we think that things are going to carry on the way they've been going on. But let's start with inflation. I used to say in my lifetime, the US dollar's lost nearly 90% of its purchasing power. That's a long period of time in some people's heads. But let's just look at this. The US has lost 25% of the US dollar has lost 25% of its purchasing power since 2020. It's just like staggering.
Absolutely. It was Lenin who said the middle class would be ground between the millstones of taxes and inflation. And I don't care what the CPI says, the information that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is really flawed. They're telling us inflation is at 3%. I can't think of many things that I buy regularly that are only up 3%. I wish they were. There's a man named John Williams who publishes a website called shadowstats.com. And all he does, Jason, is show us the way that inflation used to be calculated through the CPI prior to the revisions and the adjustments that the government made in 1980 to meet and fit their inflationary agenda. He'll tell us inflation's roughly 11%. But I would say that a nation like ours that has lived on debt for decades of joy would probably leave the generation coming next with decades of pain. There's no way around it. And yeah, I think inflation is a big deal that's not going away.
And it's something that governments want, isn't it? The Federal Reserve wants it. We'll talk about debt in a second, but that they want this. We'll explain that in a second. But the next thing really in the list of things we mentioned on this polycrisis was the risk within the banking system. Going back to what I said, it was one of the main reasons why I even began my journey that ended up in the formulation of Glint. But yeah, unrealized bank losses exceed $550 billion, or about 30% of their regulatory capital. This is not going in the right direction, is it?
No, it's not. And unrealized losses can become realized losses. Just ask Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank when you have a mass redemption. One of the things that's very ominous in all of this as well is that during the pandemic, the reserve requirement, the ratio of reserves to deposits was shrunk to zero and has never come back. So the banks, in essence, do not need to hold any reserves. You are an unsecured general creditor in the bank. You are, i.e., the last person to be paid. And the bank takes that money that you give them. It's not a deposit, it's an unsecured loan. And they take it and they buy things like treasuries right now, paying 5% on a short-term treasury. We saw how that worked out when the Fed raised interest rates by 500 basis points in less than a year. Could never happen, right? But it did happen. And when you realize that in 2009, after the financial crisis, the great financial crisis, the Congress enacted something called the Dodd-Frank law, which said that bank bailouts are now illegal. Now, some people may say, how did Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank get bailed out? Janet Yellen told the House Republican inquiry that it was a decision, a uber majority vote between herself, the president, the FOMC, which is the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC, in that these banks were too systemic to not be bailed out, but it wouldn't come at the expense of the taxpayer. The Republican senator from Oklahoma said, Madam Secretary, I thought that was made illegal. The Dodd-Frank Act said no more bailouts, just bail-ins, where anything over the FDIC limit is the responsibility of the people who are holding uninsured deposits, anything over FDIC insurance. And she said, you're right, that is true. But like I said, we viewed this as being too systemic. So he said, does that mean if a bank fails in Oklahoma, my constituents will be made whole? No, sir, she said. It would require another uber majority vote of myself, the FOMC, the FDIC, and the president. Those depositors and those constituents will be bailed in, meaning anything over FDIC, Jason, anything over that FDIC limit of 250,000 would then be bailed in to in essence pay off the indiscretions of the bank. But what's really interesting in all of this, everyone focuses on FDIC has 140 or 150 billion in assets backing 18 trillion in deposits. It's really not much of, it's a piece of dental floss underneath the high wire acting as a safety net. So yeah, it's a precarious position. And I think we are nowhere near out of the banking crisis, not even by a long shot.
No, I don't think so either. And then let's turn ourselves to government debt. We're due to hit, I think, $35 trillion this. Hey, Ray, can you put it on the other? Oh, wow, we've already hit $35 trillion worth of debt. I was looking at this the other day and I thought maybe it'll take until Thursday or Friday. Wow, that's $35 trillion worth of debt the US government has got. That is unbelievable. And it's going up at a record rate, isn't it? And the interest payments alone on this are bigger than the US defense budget, isn't it? So they've got the four main things, I think, that the government spend their money on: Social Security, defense, and actually interest payments. And now interest payments are greater than their defense budget. They're not going to, there's no way for them to cut this back, isn't it? No matter who gets into power later this year, there's no way for them to make any dint on this, is there? They're not going to give up Social Security. They're not going to give up pensions. They're not going to want to give away their defense budget. They can't stop. Can they stop paying their interest rates, their interest payments? What? I can't see an end to this. Can you?
No, and it's accelerating, Jason. The debt in 2020, the beginning of the year 2020, was 23 trillion. So since January 2020, we're up now at 35 trillion. We're up 15 trillion in just over 4 years. A trillion seconds ago, people don't really understand how big a trillion is. And I always like to throw this trite little statement out. A trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago. We are creating 1 trillion in debt every 100 days, which took 200 years to do the first time. That's in essence $100,000 every second. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and keep on going. That's 100,000 every second in debt. It is truly unsustainable. There's no, and that $35 trillion debt excludes the unfunded liabilities, things like Medicare Part B, $99 trillion in the hole. Medicare Part D, the prescription side of the equation, $22 trillion in the hole. Social Security, to your point, $77 trillion in the hole on top of government military pensions. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is really one of the last nonpartisan groups in Washington, came out recently and said that by 2031, 100% of all of the tax revenue, income tax revenue, would go just to pay interest on the debt and mandatory entitlements like Social Security and Medicaid. Now, ask yourself this question, and that doesn't take into account the 20 million people who have come into this country illegally, who need to be fed and housed and clothed and schooled and whatnot, medical, and who's going to pay for that? But ask yourself this question: how is it that a country that prides itself at being the military and financial superpower would be able to retain that status when military, as an example, is discretional right? This is not mandatory. So we're going to have to borrow money just to keep the lights on and to fund our military that we go around the world imposing sanctions upon. Using the strength of our military, we are in a very precarious position. And one of the problems with all of this, Jason, is that people are not really grasping the size of this problem. And our media doesn't do a poor job of telling people what's happening and the truth. They do no job. So the problem is people aren't able to get out of the way of what they don't see coming. If they just understood something as basic as a trillion seconds ago was 31,688 years ago, and this government, through its irresponsible fiscal policy and its brain dead monetary policy, is creating $1 trillion every 100 days, or probably faster now, which took 200 years to do the first time. And
I know.
if you
But
Google what is the largest asset of the US government, they have 5 trillion in assets according to their 2023 balance sheet, the largest asset being student debt. We're broke, we're insolvent, and our
yeah.
balance sheet really is not looking very good, that's for sure.
Sure, but I do think successive governments, no matter which government is in, they've all been building the debt up. I think maybe some more than others, of course. And this goes back to the recency bias, because people are thinking, what's changed? We've been doing this for a long time. The debt's been increasing. Yes, it has been getting higher and faster, but nothing's changed in my life. I still go to work every day. There's still water coming out the taps. The home is still heatable. But of course, what people don't realize is the game has changed. How on earth did we, first of all, got to look at how on earth did this 335 trillion worth of debt build up? And of course, the US was able to build up this debt because it was the reserve currency of the world. And originally that was a reserve currency of the world that was backed by gold. And then of course, 1971, we temporarily came off the gold standard. And then why did everyone carry on using the US dollar as a reserve currency of the world, apart from the fact that they were already doing it? So why not? Might as well carry on doing that. It was also backed up by the fact that the US went to the Middle East and promised to protect all the oil producing nations with the might of the American military complex, as long as those countries insisted on being paid in dollars for that oil. And of course, it was very much an oil centric economy globally. And so people needed dollars. Everybody needed dollars to get by, to be able to buy their oil, to run their industries, etc. So the whole world needed dollars. The buying US dollar debt, of course, was a sensible thing. And so that's been the case. The US able to build up more and more debt. And then, of course, the game changed, because now the US has weaponized their dollar one too many times. Russia, China, India, other countries are now paying for oil with other currencies, their own currencies, and even some countries with gold. And so people don't need the dollar as much as they did. And actually, I think I read a stat somewhere that US central bank US dollar reserves have dropped quite considerably. I think maybe 75% down to about 35%, something like that.
I think it's a little higher, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% or so, but it is a declining trend. And you're right. The petrodollar deal gave us an exorbitant privilege, one that we have disrespected and neglected. But there's a bigger part to the petrodollar deal. Aside from the fact that the Saudis did not re-up it here just a few weeks ago, the exclusivity deal where they said, now we're going to open it up to other currencies. The second part of the petrodollar deal was that you take the excess reserves and invest them in US treasuries. Now, if we take a look at a snapshot of the 10-year treasury from 2000 to today versus gold, the tortoise in the race, from 2000 till today, what we see is the tortoise wins, just like in the story, where the tortoise outpaces the hare at the end of the race. It's averaged 9.9% per year compounding for going on 25 years. It's doubled the performance of the 10-year treasury. But to your point, it's one thing to sanction. It's another thing to steal $5 billion of Russian assets in the form of US treasuries. It's a default. Let's call it what it is. It's theft, and it's a default. And give those proceeds, $5 billion, largely to the military-industrial complex to send weapons to the country Russia is in a war with. And it's just as stupid in the European Union what they are doing now with the interest accrued on the $280 billion in European treasuries, where Saudi Arabia has just come out and said, if indeed the EU does this, they will start dumping all of their treasuries, their European treasuries, starting with the French treasuries. It's one thing to sanction, it's another thing to steal. And when you realize this is coming from a country who is broke and insolvent, who can, Janet Yellen says to CNN, we're okay with Xi Jinping and Putin being allies. But if Xi gives one penny to Putin's war machine, we will sanction their companies, their banks, and Beijing itself. My thought is, what about the 260 billion we've given to the Ukraine with no congressional oversight, the Stinger missiles, the F-16 fighter jets, and the intelligence on where to drop it? Does that not matter? Evidently, it doesn't. So the world views us as being hypocritical, where we can make these statements and yet it don't apply to us. So the weaponization of the treasury market and the dollar is massive, let alone the mismanagement of the dollar in terms of our own fiscal and monetary affairs. You put all of that together, this is indeed what is pushing countries like Saudi Arabia into the fold of the BRICS nations, who are all the big accumulators of commodities, not just precious metals, base metals, and all of these things that you will need, as Zoltan Pozsar, to your point, calls a new era called Bretton Woods 3. Bretton Woods 1, as you mentioned, was when we took over for the pound sterling after World War II in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, saying our currency is as good as gold, and you can exchange the currency anytime you want back into gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. And that worked until 1971, to your point, when de Gaulle from France started to drain all of the gold at the Treasury and Nixon closed the gold window. So yes, Bretton Woods 2 loosely would be when Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and made that deal with the Saudi kingdom and OPEC, but that's over now. I would argue the dollar hegemony is dead. The supremacy is still here, but the hegemony is dead. They are no longer only selling oil in dollars, but more importantly, many of these countries that used to really be our creditors are now selling our treasuries in favor of gold, which has doubled its performance in the last 25 years, but has no counterparty liability. It cannot be sanctioned. And so what we are witnessing is a major shift, not only away from US dollars, as Zoltan calls it, Bretton Woods 3. He or she who has the commodities wins. And so this is a situation where countries are shedding treasuries and buying gold, which is what? The only other tier one reserve asset as reclassified in 2019 by the Bank of International Settlements. The most powerful bank in the world is telling you that gold is on par with the highest quality asset in the world, which only used to be US treasuries and dollars, and now it's gold. And this is why the central banks are shedding treasuries and accumulating gold. Jason, gold is not an investment, it is wealth. And that's the bottom line. And the biggest money in the world, the most fun and form money knows that.
Yeah, I'd say it's money. It's the only form of money. Everything else is debt. It cannot be corrupted. Its nature is not defined by a human being. It's created when two neutron stars collide. And so it's trusted globally throughout time and space. But this is actually, this whole thing is happening right now for people who haven't quite got the message. This is happening right now. The US government, the Federal Reserve Treasury auctions, I'm told, are starting to, they're certainly lackluster. I think they're offering, I'm told, lower 30-year bonds than they were previously. And now even 5-year Treasury bonds are coming under pressure. And of course, at some point, these Treasury auctions are going to fail, aren't they? And at that point, the dollar's going to collapse. The Federal Reserve will have to step in and print huge amounts of money just to buy the debt which the government's trying to raise. At that point, that's the game over, isn't it? And
yeah, welcome to Weimar Republic. That's what that is. It's monetization of the debt. Who would ever want to buy bonds of any duration from a country that's accumulating 100,000 in debt every second, a trillion every 100 days, a country that is almost at 130% debt to GDP, and there's never been a time in history that a country has crossed that line and come back. Yeah, the only treasuries, that's why you've seen such demand for these short-term treasuries, which now that yield curve is beginning, to your point, to uninvert, where rates have to rise on the back end to attract any investment whatsoever. Because again, who in their right mind would buy any duration treasury from a government that is as wayward as we are? And so, yeah, that's a problem that certainly hasn't run its course yet.
Let's move on to the wealth gap. That was one of the other points. And I think the St. Louis Fed came out recently, and actually it wasn't that recent. It's probably worse than this. But they said they've got an article that says that 10% of families in the United States own three-quarters of the pie.
Yeah.
And, that, I mean, there's something wrong when such a small group of people own such a big part of the wealth in the country. And actually, I think it's something like the five guys, the richest guys in America, own more than the bottom 50%. And I think that this is going to be driving huge social problems. And I think it's what's driving both political sides of the house to ever increasing opposite directions. They can get more and more extreme on the left and the right. I think this is a real problem. This is the problems manifesting themselves, and nobody wants to have a society where there's such a great big disparity of wealth, do they?
Yeah, that's the problem. And when you see inflation really is something that benefits the wealthy and hurts the poor and middle class, because putting food on the table and keeping a roof over your head is much more difficult for the poor and the underprivileged whose income is not keeping pace with the lying CPI numbers. But for the wealthy people, look, wealthy people don't really have massive bank accounts. Okay, maybe they do, but what they have is a lot of assets, and assets in an inflationary environment go much higher. And it's making this wealth gap worse and worse and worse. And yeah, there
Especially for the
definitely
young
is a
people, I
growing
think.
chasm between the haves and the have nots, no question. And
Yeah,
that's going to continue.
especially for the young people. They feel that they're swimming against the tide. No matter how hard they swim, how hard they try and save some money, that money's becoming worthless. If they think, oh, I imagine the young 22-year-old person, they want to get on, they want to live the American dream, they're creative, they're innovative, they've worked hard at school, and they want to go out and build a business. And they start doing that and they try and save a little bit as well. They think they want to buy an apartment or a house in 10 years' time. But every year that they're saving some money, that house is getting more and more expensive. Or as we know, the dollar is getting worth less. And so it needs more of them to buy that house. And so these young people are feeling incredibly disillusioned. They've a lot of them given up on the idea of ever owning a property. And they're turning increasingly to get rich quick schemes, or I'm going to become an influencer and try. And that's the other problem is social media is driving this unachievable kind of belief that this is the life you should all be living. And this, I think it's driving entitlement. I think it's driving problems within society more generally. But very practically, people find it nearly impossible to, with this wealth gap widening, to be able to have any hope about their future. And I think that group of people effectively going to vote. They're the ones who actually, en masse, even though the middle class is being destroyed, they're still numbers. Out of the hundreds of millions of people that live in the United States, a lot of those people are now feeling disillusioned, and I think my fear is they're going to vote in from very far left or very far right extreme kind of solutions in time. So I don't think that we've seen anything yet when it comes to the politics of this type of wealth gap.
Completely agree with you. Look, 65% of the country is living paycheck to paycheck. And even more frightening than that, 40 to 45% of America, people earning over six figures, over 100,000 a year, are living paycheck to paycheck. And yeah, it's a situation that's getting worse because the we're not seeing wages keep up with inflation, because we're being lied to about the numbers that are inflation. And when you talk about inflation and the numbers that the CPI comes up with, it's interesting. Maybe the biggest expense to working age people, kids, and anyone who's working, is not listed in the CPI, and it keeps going higher and higher, and that's taxes. So between taxes and rising costs and a devaluing dollar, yeah, it's a doom loop that you're right. The American dream is becoming further and further away from a lot of people. And when you realize that the largest asset of our government is student debt, yeah, you have a whole generation of kids coming out indebted up the yin yang, with really a very difficult challenge ahead of them just to get out of debt and to be able to pay themselves first. That's one of the things I like about your product, about Glint, is the ability to buy little amounts, a couple $100 here or $50 there or $1 if you want. You can buy whatever amount you want very easily. And I think that's something that I find very attractive about the digital platform. But you're right. It's sad to see a whole generation of kids growing up with disenfranchised with maybe not even a really great opportunity to ever realize the dream. I think of what it would be like. I started my company in 1989 before the internet as a 19-year-old guy, my dad in an office the size of a closet. And the challenges that we faced, I still can't believe that we made it to where we are 34, almost 35 years later. But there were opportunities there that I don't see here. The first house I bought was 130,000, and it's being sold right now for 7 or 800,000, even with interest rates where they are. So the cost of living is outpacing wages and savings, and it's a tough road to hoe for the young kids. I agree.
And what's crazy is people don't understand why. The media, as you said, it doesn't do any job in trying to clarify for that for them. I listen to some great podcasts on tech and things like that. And I really respect some of these amazing entrepreneurs who've built some fantastic tech businesses. They're always very much talking about not having government interfere with things because you should let the market do its job. But the problem is the market is gamed. Those billionaires who are on these podcasts, they don't want to admit they've had a hose pipe of money fired at them for the last 20 years that's given them free money because they've been able to borrow any amount of money that they wanted, often with such low interest rates that were so low that it was free. In fact, in Germany, interest rates were negative and the banks were paying companies to borrow money off them. So these
Well,
very
think of the distortions that has created in asset prices, the misallocations of resources and capital from Joe and Jane public to all the way up to the biggest corporations in Europe and in the United States, the distortions of free money. And what would it do to asset prices where hedge funds can borrow money at less than 1% and buy up houses and create hedge funds that are residential real estate based houses that they rent out, or all of the distortions that were created through the suppression of interest rates, to me, is the root of all the problems. And it's the suppression of interest rates to create the illusion of prosperity when the West, your country and mine, has offsourced all its manufacturing. We don't make anything anymore. And in many respects, more so in the UK than in the US, we don't produce anything. That's a problem. When the countries that are now uniting against the West, in particular the BRICS nations in the South and the East, they're the ones with the manufacturing capabilities and also the natural resources. It's a problem. And yeah, it's one that will become worse and worse. And I get a chuckle sometimes when I see that the United Kingdom, a broke country, is now number 1 or 2 or 3 in buying our treasuries, even more broke country. And so we take the money that we get from selling the treasuries to the UK and we paid just the interest on the debt we had already out there, and the rest goes to buy commodities from the BRICS nations who are shedding treasuries and taking any excess cash and buying gold, which is what?
Yeah.
The only other tier 1 reserve asset. And I would like to talk at some point about the decisions that were just made out of the Novigrad meeting for BRICS, where they've talked about, in principle, agreeing to a new settlement currency backed by gold. Because I think gold is going to go to a level that people don't expect. Just ask the head of the Dutch National Bank, who keeps talking about the gold revaluation account. You can't make it up. That's the name of it. Every central bank holds gold in an account called the revaluation account. And what is the probability? Everyone says the balance sheets are horrible. They can inflate or default. I've said they can find a villain, Xi Jinping and Putin and OPEC, for dumping dollars. Or how about just revaluing gold the way Roosevelt did over my shoulder here, where you just say gold's 10,000 an ounce. And now all of a sudden a putrid balance sheet just like that becomes pristine. Is it that far-fetched? I don't think it is. And I just think people need to understand that I think gold is being looked at very differently by the people who pull the strings across the globe. And I wouldn't even count something as crazy as that out of the realms of possibility.
Gold hit another all-time high. Again, not published in the media. I don't see anything in the mass media, the general media at all, as gold hit $2,474 on the 17th of July whilst I was away on my retreat. And a lot of people are saying gold's already at all-time highs. Let's not buy it. And I know that as gold's gone up 20% this last year, or more probably now, we've seen big, massive outflows in the West from ETFs. So here we are in the West going, oh, gold's at an all-time high. Let's sell and move, and interest rates are high. So let's sell our gold and put it into these banks and let's take this interest rates that they're giving us, which are pretty high compared to what we're used to. Meanwhile, in the East, everyone's buying gold, not just the central banks, but the people.
Yep. And that's the key. Supposedly, positive real return on the treasury, positive real yield, and a strong dollar, and massive outflows out of the ETFs, to your point, should be the death knell for gold, yet it keeps going higher. What does that tell you? It tells you that the investors in the West are asleep at the switch and do not understand what gold is. It is wealth. The biggest money in the world, the most sophisticated and well-informed money in the world, the central banks, are buying gold at a level the world has never seen. But even more concerning is how they are repatriating gold and bringing it into their own countries, because they don't trust the West anymore. They don't trust the Bank of England, nor do they trust the New York Fed. We saw India buy 1.5 times the amount of gold they bought all of last year in just the first 4 months of this year, which was a record year last year, and bring it all home along with the 100 metric tons they've kept at the Bank of England since 1991, because that gold gives access to the LBMA. The same thing is true on COMEX. We've seen just in the last few weeks, Saudi Arabia and Egypt and 7 or 8 African countries bring all their gold back from the New York Fed, which gives access to the COMEX. They don't care about the Western rule of law or the convenience anymore because of the steps that the West has taken to weaponize the dollar and the treasury market and the European Union. They're not immune to this as well. And so they're removing counterparty liability and buying it at a level the world has never seen. This is what is keeping the price of gold high. It is the demand that we see coming out of the central banks. You add the American public into the equation, where right now 0.5% allocation from Joe and Jane six-pack to the Harvard Endowment Fund is in gold. 0.5%. You make it 5%, that's a tenfold increase in demand. And like that, it just becomes crazy. What if it's a 10% allocation or something as crazy as more than that? So yeah, the rocket fuel potential when the West wakes up, which is being completely ignored by the West and embraced by the East, is something that I think we haven't even begun to experience what a real bull market looks like.
And interest rates going down as the Fed starts to loosen its monetary policy probably could be one of those catalysts, couldn't they?
Yeah, and you know what? Typically, right now we're at where, because you're seeing rates go down, we are seeing an uninversion of the yield curve. And you go back to 1950, and every uninversion of a yield curve, especially one that has been as inverted as record long as this has been, 2 years or however long, every single time we see a recession as soon as it uninverts, and we're heading up to this right now. And so what you basically see is the smart money. The banks, they don't want to lend their money out to the public because it's too risky, so they're buying treasuries, which is pushing the yield down. And that's something that is very ominous. They see tough times coming. And so what that would entice the Fed to do is lower rates even further and reignite the inflation engine, because we're heading into, could be the mother of all recessions, maybe even a depression, who knows, after how long and to the degree of the inversion. Yeah, you're going to see rates go down, because at that point the economy's in big trouble. So yeah, it's the self-fulfilling prophecy that's just beginning.
Yeah, and hopefully people are trying to understand what this polycrisis, this multifaceted crisis is looking at. And of course, geopolitical tensions are folding into this as well. There's something called the doomsday clock, which has been run by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for quite a while now, for numbers of decades. And unfortunately, that clock is 90 seconds to midnight. Midnight is Armageddon. We don't want to be there. And over the years, that clock has gone from many minutes to midnight, and sometimes it's got closer to it midnight, it's gone away from midnight as things have got calmer around the world. But now we're at 90 seconds to midnight. It's the closest it's ever got to that, and it's generally mainly because of the conflict in Russia's conflict in Ukraine, but also, of course, we've got challenges in the Middle East, as we all know, and they unfortunately show the prospect of mushrooming into something else. And we've seen recently that the Hezbollah and Israeli conflict with going on could get out of hand as well. So not really a great time for the world, and the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists are reflecting that with this setting.
Yeah, I hope they're wrong. I think, fortunately, I think they understand that they can beat us without ever firing a weapon. If all of there's something out there called Operation Sandman. I can't vouch for it, but there's a man that I am friendly with. I'm on his show often. His name is Mike Adams, and he talks about Operation Sandman, where 150 plus nations have agreed to dump the dollar in the treasury market at some point. When you see all of these countries shedding treasuries, where the majority of the countries holding treasuries are from the West, like Italy, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, and the Cayman Islands of all places, used to be China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and India. They're all shedding treasuries and buying gold. But what if all of a sudden you don't need to hold dollars any longer to buy oil? And the realization that there's another settlement currency. And all of these countries who have stockpiled dollars to create a synthetic demand, in essence, to the dollar, allowing us to live well beyond our means, there's a collective realization that they should be sold fast, because the world starts to shed dollars and it goes faster and faster. And treasuries and those dollars and treasuries smack the shores of the West, creating hyperinflation. The byproduct of that hyperinflation would be interest rates to rise to compensate for the loss of purchasing power, not at the behest of the Fed and Powell, but at the behest of the market, because you can't have 25% inflation and 5% interest rates. Your currency dies. But if that happened, and are we really that far away from it after everything we've talked about, after Saudi Arabia not re-upping the exclusivity deal, joining the BRICS, all of the things that we've seen, United Arab Emirates joining the BRICS, the seventh largest producer of oil in the world, who said we don't want to take dollars any longer for oil. This is something that is happening. And if all of a sudden that happened, what would happen to the system? Hyperinflation would ensue, rates would go to the moon, and stocks, bonds, real estate, the over-leveraged and undercapitalized banks, and the insurance companies loaded with treasuries, just like that, they all evaporate. That's the Klaus Schwab Great Reset. Now, is that going to happen? I sure as heck hope not. But how far away are we from something like that? And so these countries, I don't think, need to get into a kinetic war when they realize all they would need to do, in essence, would be to get to a certain point of de-dollarization and then dump. Okay, we're good enough. We've cleaned out the majority of our holdings. Dump them. Dump dollars, dump treasuries, and this country would be in a world of hurt, because we have lived for a long time and well beyond our means by the good graces of our foreign creditors, who we have now turned our back on through weaponization, through sanctioning, and through threatening. And all of the things that these BRICS nations are doing is more of a cooperative type of union instead of coercive. And I think it's a very important thing for people to understand that, to me, that doomsday clock should be in terms of the what's left in terms of the Western hegemony, whether it be my country or yours or France or the Netherlands. All of these countries have comprised 5 centuries worth of dominance over the world. And is it coming to an end? Is it coming to an end in the face of what amounts to the majority of human population in the Belt Road Initiative, in the BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Eurasian Economic Union, that together represent 80% of human population, 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals on the planet, the majority of all of the commodities on the planet. They refine 100% of the rare earths. That is 100%. What did they do? They bought the London Metals Exchange recently, the base metals. They're striking deals on their Belt Road through under-industrialized countries in South America and Africa, and they are gobbling up all the commodities. What did Zoltan Pozsar say? Bretton Woods 3 about commodities. Yeah, it's never been more important to look at gold as wealth, because the biggest money in the world, who knows the playbook, including the BIS, who reclassified it the only other tier 1 asset on the planet, they are looking at gold as something vastly different than we have for the last 50 years. And I think it's time for people to unconventional times, as they say, call for unconventional thought. And this is where we are right now, Jason.
Yeah. And of course, all of this created because we dropped off the gold standard in the first place and entered this, what we called an unjust monetary system. What do we mean by that? I think people are starting to understand what we're talking about here, but it's perfectly described by the cantillon effect. A chap called Cantillon explained that those closest to the money supply benefit disproportionately from everybody else.
Sure.
So obviously, governments are the first ones to be able to benefit from that. They're able to print money to pay for unsustainable election promises or activities. They're the ones that means they can fight these forever wars. You've then got the banks themselves. They're able to effectively make huge amounts of money by selling something that they can literally create on a keyboard. They're given permission just to create money out of thin air. Most people think wrongly that the way banks work is that you and I deposit money into the bank and then they're able to lend some of that out to other people. No, when you put those deposits in the banks, a lot of those are invested in these very same government securities that we've been talked about. And when they lend money to people, they literally go on the keyboard and they print it out of thin air. And of course, those banks make a huge amount of money. Everyone in the banking sector makes a huge amount of money. Can you imagine if you had a vegetable store and you didn't have to buy your vegetables that you were selling? What a great business that would be. And then those next closest to the money supply are the richest in society. Again, we touched upon that earlier on, where we explained that so the wealth you've increasingly over the last 20 years, you've been able to borrow money for free nearly and be able to buy very real assets that have been going up in price, while everyone else couldn't do that. And then, of course, those people who can't borrow money, again, as I said before, it felt like you're swimming against the tide. But let's just quickly talk about commercial property. COVID obviously drastically changed how people are using office spaces and things like that. And I think there's a very good chance that we've got a big impending, or there's a reality that we've got a big impending commercial property crisis coming up. Fitch ratings explained that the commercial property crisis is likely to be bigger than the 2008 commercial property crisis, because these companies don't have anybody in their offices anymore, do they? And their mortgages will be coming up for renewal and things like that. And a lot of them took these mortgages out when interest rates were zero. They've got a big problem coming ahead, haven't they, when they have to remortgage, and they won't be able to because their property portfolio won't be worth as much as it was because there's nobody in them. They're not getting any yield, and interest rates are much higher than they were before.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's no one in these properties. That's called the urban doom loop, which is the cycle of people moving away from the city in these big cities as things get worse. Then things get worse because more people moved away. And when you talk about commercial property taxes, they make up a massive chunk of many of the city budgets. Think of the municipal bonds that are sold. The decreased revenue force, all of the leaders of these cities to curtail municipal services, fire and police and all of the things that we need. And so they have to cut key programs, and in turn cuts the quality of life, which in turn pushes more residents out, leading to the self-reinforcing doom loop. I'll give you an example of how crazy it is. They say 70% of all the commercial loans are held by the regional banks. So get this one. Now, I haven't seen one quite like this. There's some bad ones, but this one takes the cake. The former One AT&T Center, which is a 44-story tall building, the third tallest building in St. Louis, Missouri. It sold for $205 million in 2006 to a real estate investment trust. It just sold for $3.6 million. $3.6 million, Jason, you too can own a 44-story tall office building in downtown St. Louis. So when you talk about this commercial real estate massive problem, it's huge. And going back to what we were saying earlier, a lot of these loans and a lot of these purchases were made when interest rates were suppressed. So the real value is distorted. The purchase price was distorted. What is something worth at a 0 federal funds rate versus a 5% federal funds rate? What is it worth at a 3% mortgage versus a 7% mortgage? I know it's different in commercial, but the point of it is, yes, this will and I believe, will be the catalyst for big problems with regional banks. And the problem with all of the banks is similar to why they had to bail out AIG in 2008, is they're all systemically tied together through derivatives. And AIG was the reinsurer to all the credit default swaps. And so, yeah, this is a situation that is really bad. And yeah, they say there's 50 or 60 banks right now that are terminal because of their exposure to these unrealized losses. But how many of these write-downs can they take? It's a scary deal, where the two biggest hotels in San Francisco, which at one point was the coolest city in America, the owners just walked away from them, gave the keys back to the lender and say, keep the equity, we're out. because the
Yeah,
cost of running it was more than the value of the
yeah,
hotel. It's a scary thing. And that too is not over yet,
yeah.
unfortunately.
And Andy, a year and a half ago, I was stood at the top of a really big office building in San Francisco, floor to ceiling glass, and I'm looking out the window. I can see 20 high-rise offices, and I couldn't see one person in any of the floors in any of the buildings. No lights on. This was midweek San Francisco.
Yep.
Unbelievable. This
Yep.
is real. This is
It is
not. This
real.
is all these things we're
Absolutely.
talking about are real. They're happening. They're unfolding as we speak. And then, of course, we then get this wonderful promise progress with artificial intelligence and advances in technology with robotics and things. The IMF saying just recently that 40% of all global employment could be disrupted by AI. I don't think they give a date on that. I don't think anyone could give a timeline on this, but I think there's no doubt that AI and robotics promise certainly at some point relatively soon in the next 5, 10, or 15 or 20 years to be able to have massive disruption on the jobs market. I know that lots and lots of CEOs, founders of tech companies are all working really hard to already integrate AI into their businesses and create efficiencies. But what's this going to do to the jobs market? Ultimately, I think it promises a utopia. The idea that we don't have to do some of the mundane work that we have to do currently in society, that we maybe could turn our minds to something a bit more esoterical, questions of who are we, where do we come from, what is the meaning of life, etc. When you don't have work to do, you have to move to something a bit more creative and a bit more intellectual like that. But in the meantime, how do we move from the society we're in to that society? It seems to me that it's that the advancements are happening so quickly that we're actually going to have huge amounts of pain and disruption as we
Of
go
course.
through this. And
Massively, massively deflationary. Absolutely.
and technology should be deflationary. Unfortunately, over the last 50 years, that hasn't been felt. We should have been having much better standards of living than we have by now. We should be leading. We shouldn't be having to work. I don't know about you, but I feel like as I've got older, I've had to work harder and harder as I've got older, rather than being able to get work less and less. Cup families, both parties, men and the husband and the wife, both having to work, whereas my parents' day, only one of them had to work, and houses were easily affordable. Technology should have had a very positive, slow but sure deflationary pressure. And I don't know what this kind of obsession around inflation is all about. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, I think, was asked in one of the big US wonderful ways they interview people like them. One of the senators said, "Can you just explain to me what is this 2% target all about? Why is it, for instance, they choose 2%?" And the answer is, after a bit of a pause, because it was obvious that he didn't really have a proper answer, it's what everybody does. That's the chairman
It's the
of the
dumbest
Federal
thing in
Reserve.
the world, Jason. Why have 2% inflation? It was arbitrary. But how about negative 2%? The lower
Yeah.
inflation, the
Well, I
higher the
think,
standard of living. What it does is it enables them to go deeper and deeper into debt and do what all governments have done since Roman times. Do you know why silver coins have ridges on them? The reason is that it goes all the way back to Roman times when they had expanded their empire far and wide and they had to pay their soldiers and they were running out of money. So they started to trim the edges of the coins. And if you do that enough, you get enough scraps to make more coins until finally they started to take all the metal out of the coins and their empire collapsed. It's the
yeah,
same thing. Governments, since the beginning of time, have chosen inflation over austerity. And that's what they're doing here. They're choosing
yeah,
inflation instead of the tough decisions. So let's just say 2%. But what that means is that in 5 years, you've lost 10%. What that also means is that in 36 years, you've lost half of the value of your currency. The law of 70 seconds. You take the interest rate you're factoring and divide it into 72. So at 10% inflation in 7.2 years, your currency is cut in half. So
yeah,
when you talk about your purchasing power, so when you talk about the reason they hide the real numbers, they exclude food, energy, and housing, and they just pulled coffee out of the CPI in April because it was up 80% and replaced it with something like tea. So they don't want us to know what inflation really is and how much currency purchasing power we are really using. But you're right, inflation is not going away, because even if we balance the budget today, balance it, who's going to pay the unfunded liabilities of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and government military pensions? And we're a country that is addicted like a heroin addict through irresponsible monetary or fiscal policy into spending more than we
Yeah.
take in. So yeah, inflation is something that has been here forever. It will continue to be here and probably will get much worse before it gets better.
Yeah, as you say, they want it. And of course, after World War II, there was this huge productivity boom, which combined with some taxes and not a huge increase, they were able to get the economy going again. And AI, of course, I'm a great I love technology, yes, and I think it's amazing what it can bring. But there's this belief that maybe I think in some quarters that the productivity boom on technology will be able to sort all our problems out. But of course, you've got this counter stream that it's also going to disrupt jobs. But also, we're also going to be starting to live longer. There's recent studies have come out explaining that we're on the verge of reversing age. And that might be helpful in the short term, I think, because of course we've got this aging population, which is a problem for society because they're all entering pensionable age. As you said, these unfunded liabilities on pensions and things. What do they do about that? Already countries in Europe are starting to increase the age at which you can have your pension as the population gets older. Longevity technology and advances in health mean that people could be living longer, not just living longer, but actually having a much better standard of living. I saw that they took two mice, aging mice, and then they gave one of them some of these treatments, and it looks like it's a teenager compared to the other one, which looks like a very old mouse. So if this stuff it could very quickly come into society. We could very quickly see a situation where we have people living longer and actually being healthier within that age. And I personally am all up for that. At 54, I'm thinking, I hope I'm on that bandwagon. But what does it mean for society? Obviously, these things we're talking about, AI and health and longevity and stuff, they might have different timelines when it comes to the impact on society compared to some of the other things we've been talking about.
I think we're seeing the impact on society already. My son, who just came to work for my company after getting his CPA from one of the big three accounting firms, who needs a young kid out of college paying almost six figures a year to analyze a balance sheet when AI can do it for free in 1 second? Who needs a doctor to look at an X-ray when AI can do it in a second? Who needs all of these professions that are mundane but have created countless jobs that can be done at a fraction of the cost without any of the HR problems by AI? I find it to be frightening, to be honest with you. And yeah, technology is amazing. All of these things are amazing, but the ramifications of what it truly means, I don't think anyone's really figured that part out yet. But I think a lot of jobs, hopefully there'll be others that are created, but a lot will go by the wayside. And not a bad idea for people to learn a trade, because there's always need for plumbers and electricians and these things too, because that's one thing. Fortunately, AI, unless they build robots who can come in and fix your toilet, maybe, who knows? The world is,
Well,
is certainly evolving.
it might actually help this wealth divide. Those people who've been benefiting disproportionately might not be the ones who have the jobs anymore. But
Right.
unfortunately,
That's the point.
but,
That's the point.
but unfortunately, I think that's not going to be the case because they'll be the ones owning all the AI stock, all the
Yeah.
AI businesses. So we're going to have this situation where you see it in computer games, the growth of the mega corporations that run the world. If you think about AI and robotics, for instance, who owns that tech? And in a world where effectively you have unlimited labor and potentially with the advancements in, say, cold fusion, unlimited energy, what's the only thing that's left? It's the resources. So if they own the IP on the AI and the robotics, and they buy up the resources, then effectively you could have five people owning 100% of the planet.
Yeah. Well,
So
and maybe that's why you see this massive rush by countries like China to accumulate as much as they can in terms of natural resources. And that's why Zoltan Pozsar says Bretton Woods 3 is all about natural resources. He or she who has the commodities wins. And in the environment that I see coming, Jason, I think he or she who loses least wins in terms of the public. That's why I am a big advocate on gold right now. It's not an investment, it's wealth that has outlived 2 world wars, German hyperinflation, the Great Depression, every pandemic. And we'll be here in the year 3000 after the dollar bills in my wallet or the pounds in yours are hanging from a frame in a museum as an example of what used to be. Gold will still be immutable wealth. And that's something that AI won't get rid of either. So that's why I'm a big advocate for gold, because these times are changing so rapidly that the interesting thing about it is that 5,000 years after gold was talked about hundreds of times in the Bible, we still see the most well-informed traders in the world, the central banks, buying it like it's going out of style. And that to me means something. So yeah, these are interesting times, my man. As the Chinese curse says, may you live in interesting times. I have a feeling over the next 90 days, it will probably be the most interesting time in my 34-year career, but I stand ready to roll with the changes and look forward to riding shotgun with you moving forward and talking about all of these things. I think I hope that some people get something substantive out of it, because the truth of it is there are a lot of people I care an awful lot about here in the States that are very well informed, very well read. They just read the wrong stuff. And intellect and knowledge of where we are or where we're going are not symbiotic, it seems. So very well read people are being led to slaughter and have no idea what's coming and therefore can't get out of the way of it. So if we can help 1 or 2 people along the way, that's great by me. And I couldn't think of a nicer guy to do it with. So I think this was a good first podcast. I look forward to many more moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. The sentiment's the same with me. When I saw the light and I had the veil pulled apart from me in 2008 and came awakened to the problems and challenges around, I felt like I had to do something about it. So it was like a vocation. I thought to myself, I can't be laying on my deathbed thinking, if only I'd done something, knew something and didn't know something, didn't do anything about it. That would have been a disaster for me, especially because I have children, and one day I'm sure I have grandchildren and have friends as you do. We care about everybody, and I'm not like a doomsday guy, but this is real stuff. We've been
There's a
talking.
fine line between pessimism and realism right now, Jason. And you're right. It's tough. It's lonely being the guy, the little boy who cried wolf. If you look at the new abridged version, I think you and I are on the cover. But let's not forget the last page of the book, The Wolf Comes. And it's a noble endeavor to want to help people. The thing of it is that this is something that's not about cocktail parties and Ferraris and yachts. This is the opposite. And that's why people don't want to hear about it. I'd rather know what's coming at me and have a chance to not only survive, but maybe even thrive, maybe even get out of the way of what's coming. And you're right. Most people don't want to hear about it, but hey, I think that'll change. That's why they say there's no bull market like a gold bull market, because the other bull markets appeal to our greed. They say we're motivated by greed and by fear. There is no stronger motivational force than fear. And I'm not trying to pander to that. I've never, ever sold gold as something based on fear. To me, it's been always about wealth and money. I hope I never need to use it. I can give to my children. If I need it, I'm damn glad I have it. Maybe for an opportunity, not just an emergency. And if not, I know I'm leaving a lasting legacy. But I will tell you, for the first time in my adult life, I'm scared. I'm scared of what's coming. I'm scared of what's happened to my country, the border, the immigration, the electoral process, the judicial system, the lawlessness, all of it, the addiction to spending, the debt, everything. I'm concerned. And I think for people not to be and to be consumed with recency bias is going to be a big mistake. So people can say I'm a doom and gloomer. I'm not. I'm actually a very happy-go-lucky guy who just has the curse of seeing things that over the last 4 years that I've publicly said seem to be coming true. Maybe it's a curse, maybe it's not, but I hope I'm helping anyone, a few people.
You are helping, and this is about hope at the end of the day. I called the company Glint, for instance, because I wanted a glint of hope. I think we both want that. And we called this podcast The Resilient Compass because we want to talk about resilience. In order to talk about resilience, you need to talk about the challenges first. Then we can talk about the resilience and help us guide ourselves and together towards the solution and towards the light. So on that note, I just want to say, great to chat with you again today, Andy. That looking forward to doing it again next week. Thanks for everybody who came on and listened to this. This is fantastic. to welcome you to our first episode. But please do subscribe to the show. It's very important. It's important for the mission. It's important for spreading the word about what's going on. So yeah, we've got some exciting and unmissable guests lined up that you don't want to miss. So do that and you'll be informed about what's going on. And please follow us both across all different social media platforms. There'll be some links in the descriptions. Hit the subscribe button now before you forget, and see you next week.